It had started with a small slip of paper, a forgotten remnant tucked between the pages of an old photo album. The yellowed scrap bore only a name, Emily, and a date, along with a hospital name that rang no bells in Caroline's mind. She had been sifting through her mother's belongings, trying to make sense of the years they had spent together, when she found it. That day, she hadn't realized it would become the first thread in unraveling the fabric of her entire family's history. Caroline had always known her family was a little more complicated than others. Her mother had raised her alone, without much talk of her father. The story Caroline had grown up with was simple. Her father had left before she was born, never wanting to be involved in her life. As painful as that was, Caroline had accepted it. It was her reality. She had always wondered why her mother had kept so much of their family history hidden, but she chalked it up to the sadness of a single mother raising a child on her own. But the name Emily and the date on that slip of paper didn't fit. Caroline was born on that exact day in the very same hospital. It was enough to unsettle her, but not enough to unravel everything. At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. It was as if a door had been cracked open, and behind it lay answers she hadn't even known she was seeking. The next few weeks were consumed by questions. Who was Emily? Why had her mother never mentioned her? She tried to push the thoughts aside, telling herself that maybe it was just a mistake, an irrelevant piece of paper from someone else's life. But it gnawed at her, kept her awake at night. It wasn't until she stumbled across an old box in the attic, full of forgotten papers, that everything began to unravel. Caroline had been rummaging through her mother's things for what felt like hours, frustration mounting as she found nothing but old receipts, letters, and scraps of notes. But then she found a birth certificate. Her birth certificate. At first, it looked perfectly ordinary, her name, the date, and her mother's signature. But just below that, something strange caught her eye. It wasn't her name listed in the hospital records. It was Emily. Caroline's heart raced as she stared at the paper. The name was there, clear as day, and next to it, her mother's name and the date of her birth. But the name was wrong. Emily. Who was Emily? Suddenly, pieces of her childhood began clicking into place. Memories she had dismissed before now took on new meaning. There had been moments, whispers among relatives at family gatherings, questions that were quickly shut down by her mother when asked about her birth. And now the realization hit her with full force. She wasn't an only child. She had a twin. The revelation left Caroline reeling. The idea that she had lived her entire life without knowing there was another person out there, someone who shared her blood, her history, her very existence, was too much to process. How had her mother kept this from her? Why had she never mentioned it? The questions consumed her, and the only person who could provide answers was no longer around to give them. Caroline's mother had passed away a year earlier, taking her secrets with her to the grave. There was no one left to ask. But Caroline was determined to find out the truth. She spent weeks digging through every record she could find. Hospital records, adoption agencies, even contacting the hospital directly, though the information they provided was limited due to privacy laws. Every piece of information she uncovered only added more questions. She found no trace of an adoption, no legal records that tied Emily to another family. It was as if her twin had simply disappeared. The breakthrough came when Caroline decided to look into the hospital's historical archives. After hours of combing through documents, she stumbled across something that made her blood run cold. A list of children born in the hospital on the day of her birth. There, next to her own name, was another, Emily Grace Thompson, her twin. And next to that name was a notation that sent chills down her spine. Placed for private adoption. Confidential. The more she uncovered, the darker the truth became. It turned out that her mother hadn't given Emily up willingly. The adoption had been arranged in secret, without her mother's consent. Caroline's grandparents, desperate to cover up a scandal, had intervened. They had deemed it too much for her mother to raise two children on her own, especially with the father long gone. So, they had taken matters into their own hands, arranging for Emily to be quietly adopted by another family. Caroline couldn't believe what she was reading. Her mother, the woman who had raised her with so much love, had been forced to give up one of her children. The thought of what her mother must have gone through, knowing that her daughter was out there, being raised by someone else, while she had no choice but to carry on, was too painful to comprehend. And yet, her mother had never spoken of it, not once. She had carried that burden with her all those years, alone. But now Caroline knew, and she couldn't ignore it. Driven by a need to uncover every last detail, Caroline began the search for Emily in earnest. It was slow at first. Records were incomplete, names had been changed, and private adoptions were notoriously difficult to trace. But she didn't give up. There was something about this search that felt different, like she was on the verge of finding not just a sibling, but a missing part of herself. Months passed before Caroline found what she was looking for. Through a combination of online research, DNA testing, and old-fashioned detective work, she eventually traced Emily to a small town just 2 hours away. Her twin sister was living a life parallel to hers, in a way that felt both surreal and heartbreaking. The first time Caroline saw Emily, it was like looking into a mirror. They had the same dark hair, the same eyes, even the same small mannerisms that made them seem more like reflections of each other than strangers. But they were strangers. Emily had no idea she had a twin. She had grown up in a loving family, blissfully unaware of the secrets that had shaped her life. Caroline didn't approach her right away. She watched from a distance, unsure of how to proceed. How do you tell someone they've been living a lie? That their entire life has been built on a foundation of secrets and betrayal? More importantly, how do you ask someone to welcome you into their life when you've been nothing more than a ghost in theirs? Eventually, Caroline couldn't wait any longer. She wrote Emily a letter, just like the one her mother had written all those years ago but never sent. In it, she explained everything, the family secrets, the adoption, the truth about their shared past. She didn't know how Emily would react, or if she would even believe her, but she had to try. The truth was too important to keep buried any longer. A week passed before Emily responded. Her letter was short but powerful. She had always felt like something was missing in her life, she said, but she had never been able to put it into words. Now suddenly everything made sense. They met for the first time on a chilly autumn day, sitting across from each other in a small cafe that was halfway between their two towns. The conversation was awkward at first, but as the hours passed, the walls between them began to crumble. They talked about everything, about their childhoods, their parents, their lives. They laughed about their similarities and cried over the years they had lost. But there was something else, too. Something darker. Emily had uncovered secrets of her own. Her adoptive family, though loving, had known about the circumstances of her adoption but had kept it from her. They had been part of the deal that had torn the sisters apart. And even now, all these years later, those decisions weighed heavily on Emily's heart. Together, Caroline and Emily realized that their reunion wasn't just about reconnecting as sisters. It was about facing the ghosts of their past, the people who had made choices for them without ever considering the consequences. It was about understanding that the bond of blood, no matter how fractured by time and secrets, could still be rebuilt. But it wouldn't be easy. The scars ran deep. As they sat there, talking late into the night, one thing became clear. The journey wasn't over. They had found each other, but now they had to decide what to do with the truth. Should they confront the family members who had orchestrated the adoption? Should they expose the lies that had shaped their lives? Or should they let the past stay buried, focusing instead on building a future together as sisters? Caroline and Emily both knew the answer to those questions wouldn't come easily. But for the first time, they weren't alone. They had each other, and that was enough to begin.